Fasten your time machine belts. We're entering a portal to the past to discover erstwhile episodes and historical happenings. Airing on KYMN Radio, produced by the Northfield History Center, and hosted by Kosmo Esplan, this is Trek Through Time. Welcome, radio listeners, or rather, howdy, and thank you for tuning in to Trek Through Time. I'm your host, Kosmo Esplan, coming to you from the historic Scriver Building in downtown Northfield. And perhaps for the first time ever, I'm wearing Western apparel. Current radio technology doesn't allow you to see that, though you should be able to tell nonetheless given my southern drawl and twangy way of speaking. That's sarcasm, by the way. My Western persona needs some work. Unless you live under a rock or halfway around the world, you can probably guess why I've decided to don such apparel in the month of September. The defeat of Jesse James Days is here once again, marking the 76th occasion that the beloved town-wide festivities will commence. Given that Trek Through Time, or Triple T, which I hope you realize is the program you're listening to now, is dedicated to taking you on a vintage voyage through the extraordinary events of Northfield's rich past, it wasn't that difficult to think of a topic to explore this month that would coincide with the celebration. But more on that and our special guest in just a moment. First, it's time to, as usual, check out History in the Making and discover what noteworthy occurrence this last August will make its way into Northfield's memorabilia. Normally for this segment, I choose a development from the past month that reinforces Northfield's power as a community to make something new, interesting, and inspiring happen. This time, I'll be focusing on one person. Wayne Eddy, often dubbed the voice of Northfield, sadly passed away on Saturday, August 17th. This heartbreaking news comes after the Northfield celebrity turned 83 years old in May, an age which included over 50 of those years broadcasting in one way or another at KYMN Radio. Arriving at Northfield's first commercial station in his 20s after several media-based experiences, including forecasting as a weatherman on TV in Austin, Wayne had plenty of experience to transform the brand-new, risky radio station into a local staple with an enduring, decades-long success. But it was ultimately his charm, iconic radio voice, parental-like care for the station, on- and off-air personality, and, perhaps most vitally, his investment in the community. Funny and droll enough to crack jokes as quick as a flash, yet also sincere and kind enough to provide mentorship to new radio recruits like outgoing owner Jeff Johnson, Wayne was the one who put KYMN on the map, and is largely the reason why it's still operating today. Granted the 1990 Haywood Award, winner of the Minnesota Broadcasters Association Board of Directors 1997 Personality of the Year Award, that's a mouthful, and 2007 inductee into the Minnesota Broadcasters Hall of Fame, Wayne's awards don't define his career, but showcase how illustrious it was. Everyone who has had their lives impacted by KYMN Radio in one way or another, whether that's listening to the morning show every weekday or having the honor of hosting a series like me, can attribute that opportunity to the man, the myth, the legend, Wayne Eddy. However, Wayne's biography doesn't end with KYMN. In fact, it only begins. Holding the designation of one of the Northfield Historical Society's initial founders, and playing a key role in headquartering the organization right here in the prominent Scriver Building, learning from time with the Northfield JCs, contributing his wealth of knowledge to the plethora of state or local committees he was on, serving as a loyal and steadfast defeat of Jesse James Days volunteer, and being, as KYMN's online tribute put it, quote, perhaps the single biggest promoter of Northfield itself over the last half-century. Wayne's many experiences are ripe for a detailed account of his life to be penned and published. Featured in that book would undoubtedly be Wayne's annual appearance in the DJJD Grand Parade and his famous performance in the James Younger Gang reenactments, a personal favorite activity of his that could spin off its own collection of stories, including a widely remembered performance in which he was accidentally, no joke, set on fire. Tales like these have made their way into certain articles from Susan Vistendahl's Historic Happenings series, and even town lore as a whole. In short, he will be remembered. More information, and trust me, there's actually much more, about Wayne's dedicated life can be found on the memorial to him via kymnradio.net or by listening to the first episode of Trek Through Time from June, in which Jeff Johnson and I went through the history of KYMN and Northfield Radio altogether, with some highlights of Wayne's career delved into. It turned out to be a timelier show than I was expecting. I personally want to extend my condolences to Wayne's surviving family, including his wife Julie and their daughter Angel, as well as thank Wayne for his many years committed to making Northfield a better place. The term local legend has no better use. As we now look ahead to the future, the Northfield History Center will be heavily involved in supplying their share of exciting events to help celebrate the DJJD Jamboree that practically every Northfielder has enjoyed at some point in the Big Bash's history, including Wayne Eddy. Although this year's convention of sorts technically began yesterday, the real party kicks off tonight with the popular Townie Night, always held once a year on Thursday evening. The History Center will be contributing to the TN, as the hipsters call it, with their typical open house from 5 o'clock to 7 o'clock p.m., so come on by to mingle and jingle. It'll be a hog-killing time, as a true cowboy would say. When you drop by, also check out their new exhibits inspired by bank rate history. In addition to the permanent display detailing the historical events that took place at the First National Bank of Northfield, the NHC will also unveil 2 fresh exhibits, one devoted to icon Joseph Lee Haywood and the Haywood family, including his widow Martha, and another one centering on Cole Younger and his 2 brothers, who were key players in the James Younger Gang. Apparently, they believed themselves to be more youthful than everyone. That might have a 20% laugh rate. But don't hold my bad jokes against the History Center, because they have a gripping new lecture series coming up this weekend as well. Andy Ebling will present on the guns of the Northfield Raid 2 times, a premise that sounds pretty self-explanatory, while Earl Weinmann will provide 3 different talks: the James Younger Gang before the raid, the escape of the James Younger Gang from Northfield, and the myths, lies, and misconceptions about the James Younger Gang. That's a lot of James Youngering. These seminars will take place in the History Center archives for about an hour and a half at different times on Friday and Saturday. To purchase a $20 admission and find times, register at northfieldhistory.org and do it sooner rather than later, as seats are sure to sell quickly. In fact, do it now, but don't turn the show off. Multitasking is good. Finally, the NHC's biggest fundraiser of the year will commence on Sunday in the form of their annual Outlaw Run. To be clear, this is not open to criminals only, or at all, and it doesn't revolve around fleeing from the police either. Instead, the Outlaw Run, or again hipster-based, the OR, is a 5K, 15K run and walk that occurs on a particular route, named after the valiant posses who pursued the remaining members of the James Younger Gang post-bank raid. Check it out to run or walk off those onion rings. Taking a peek later into the month, the Grand Events Center will be holding their monthly Monday at the Movies, sponsored by Culture Crew, the local trifecta made up of the Northfield Public Library, the Northfield Arts Guild, and the Northfield History Center. To figure out the pick of the month, I will once again hand you a lifeline with 3 clues designed to unlock your movie detection skills. Clue number 1. This 2006 film holds the record for longest standing ovation at the Cannes Film Festival, with 22 minutes of applause. Clue number 2. Visionary filmmaker Guillermo del Toro wrote and directed this Oscar-winning dark fantasy film set in 1944 Spain. Clue number 3. Utilizing synonym magic, another title for the flick could be Skillet's Maze. If you still can't decode the hints, maybe just try Google or Wikipedia. I should mention that this month's film is rated R, so enjoy an adults-only movie showing that will chill your bones on September 16th, whatever that actually means. Last but not least, local historian Jeff Sauvé will be giving an author talk at 50 North later this month about his upcoming book, Pioneer Women, Voices of Northfield's Frontier. Don't forget about it if you're interested in hearing Jeff discuss the latest installment in his prolific writing career. If questions are included, try stumping him on something local history related. If so, you have succeeded in doing the impossible. Thank you to the Northfield History Center for their continued community contributions, CCC, and there will be more next month. Before then, though, it's time to dive into this month's riveting subject matter. Well, it's now officially September in case you haven't noticed, which means that Northfield's biggest event of the year is near. Ooh, poetry. This is my 4th trek through time, and I've enjoyed covering fascinating topics instrumental to Northfield's story so far. As previously mentioned, June's inaugural episode featured a conversation with KYMN veteran Jeff Johnson about the history of Northfield radio, followed by July's interview focusing on the history of Northfield pizza with Basil's Pizza owner Dimitri Pitsavas, and longtime Northfield Arts Guild collaborator Patsy Dude joined me in August to speak about the history of Northfield theater. All of these shows can be found archived on KYMN's website or on the Northfield History Center's YouTube channel. Continuing with the inevitable plug, you can follow Triple T on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, iHeartRadio, or Amazon Music, and receive notifications when new episodes drop. Anyway, back to my point. I've learned a lot from discovering these unique pieces of Northfield's past with the help from those who have played a role in sustaining that history, and I hope that those listening have learned something as well. But, as you may have suspected, we're moving on from the niche subjects this month to shift the spotlight onto perhaps the most monumental moment in Rice County history. Our trusty axis of antiquity for September will rotate around, drumroll please, the history of the Northfield Bank Raid. This iconic event, infamously known not only throughout the town and the state, but recognized by old Wild West fans across the country, is one of the biggest reasons that Northfield is what it is today. And for the better, although you wouldn't suspect that when robbery is involved. The year 1876 is more well known in town despite 1855 being the founding year, thanks to Jesse James and his gang of 7 others making some ill-fated appearances on the afternoon of September 7th. Rumors, speculation, and hearsay have made their rounds over the years, but the accepted historical account goes generally something like this. Journeying north from a string of robberies in Missouri, the James Younger gang consisted of brothers Jesse and Frank James, brothers Cole, Jim and Bob Younger, Clell Miller, William Chadwell, and Charlie Pitts. After galloping through several towns in Minnesota, the crew made their way to Northfield by the morning of September 7th, armed substantially with revolvers, wearing white dusters, and being perhaps slightly drunk. Hey, they were outlaws anyway, what did they have to lose? The gang began their objective at 2:00 p.m., robbed the National Bank of Northfield, and ride off even richer than they were before. That's not exactly what happened. Frank James, Bob Younger, and Charlie Pitts parked their horses in front of the bank, which existed right here in this incredibly historic Scriver building, and entered the location when Cole Younger and Clell Miller arrived to keep watch, with Jesse James, Jim Younger, and Bill Chadwell providing additional safety backup. Joseph Lee Haywood, a name that should be more than familiar to Northfielders, the 39-year-old employee who was acting cashier during the bank raid, he's recognized as not only the hero of the historical incident, but also the person who ensured Northfield's future prosperity instead of poverty. The husband, father, and Civil War veteran literally protected Northfield's money with his life. His brave and revered opposition to the ruthless demands of the impatient and violent fugitives ultimately cost him a bullet to the head by the cruel, merciless coward Frank James. Haywood's sacrifice is what makes the town's annual celebration so special every year, given that Northfield can come together as a community to commemorate his crucial role. But what was going on outside that made a normally smooth and successful James Younger gang robbery go terribly wrong? Well, Haywood gave the most that day, but he wasn't the only hero. Practically from the moment that Clell Miller and Cole Younger arrived at Bridge Square, things started going sideways for the gang. Culminating in the death of outlaws Clell Miller and Bill Chadwell, as well as serious injuries for a few of the others. However, civilian casualties increased to 2 when Swedish immigrant Nicholas Gustafsson was unfortunately struck by a gunshot from Cole Younger during the action that killed him several days later. The remaining gang members fled the town and would run into further tribulations along their path out of Minnesota. Stay tuned for their own fate when our guest tells it all coming up. So if you don't pay attention to the reenactments every year, that's essentially what happened. Northfield fought with its soul that day, and for the most part, it triumphed. Up until 1876, Jesse James and his gang hadn't faced much pushback, and this level of defeat was unprecedented for them. That is why we have dedicated the weekend after Labor Day every single year since 1948 to preserving this historic happening and ensuring that the day's heroes still receive the honor that they are due. Courage was the dominant emotion on September 7th, 1876. Just as a side note, does anyone else think it's rather ironic that Jesse and his friends came here to steal Northfield's money, but ended up padding the pockets of downtown owners for decades to come? Now, it might seem like I've recited most of this story, but there is, as usual, a plethora of more knowledge and information to explore. After all, a truly remarkable amount of action occurred in just around 7 minutes, not to mention the events that led up to the situation and the history-altering aftermath that transpired following the episode, which would change the course of the Wild West forever. You can take a deep sigh of relief knowing that I won't be rattling off that information. I'll throw you a lifeline and give you some time away from my voice by inviting on the Memoir Maestro. Alright, this month's Memoir Maestro is Earl Weinmann. A former middle school teacher well-versed in Northfield history, Earl has supplied immense assistance and understanding of the 1876 bank raid to the Northfield History Center, which includes training all of their tour guides. Engaging and passionate about the bank raid, I'm beyond excited to dig deeper into Northfield's most famous historical event with Earl and excavate more of this immortal chronicle. So get ready, cowboys and girls, as we turn back the clock to 1876 and gallop back in time with Earl Weinmann to discover the history of the Northfield bank raid. Welcome to Trek Through Time, Earl. Thanks for doing this. Great to see you. Great to meet you. We haven't met before, so I'm excited about it.
Thank you, Cosmo. I'm honored to be here.
Yeah, great. Honored to have you. I've heard a lot about your name in the kind of the bank raid world and the talking about the history of it. I know that you trained the Historical Society's tour guides, but first let's get a little background on you and your history with history and why you got into the bank raid.
Okay, well, I graduated from Mankato State. It was called Mankato State back then, with a degree in history. And I always wanted to be a teacher. I knew that from my high school years, and so that's what I majored in. And, excuse me, I had a series of jobs until I came here in Northfield in 1993. One of the elements of my curriculum at that time was history of Northfield, including the raid. Now, I got to be honest with you, when I came into Northfield, I thought Northfield was a little bit over the top regarding the raid. I thought, ugh.
I don't think that's uncommon when people first get that impression, maybe. But
right. And I didn't really know much about it, but I thought, well, okay, I'll learn it because I have to teach it. But as I learned it, I started to realize this is a pretty cool story about some pretty brave people here in Northfield that set the tone not only for the future of Northfield, but made a historical connection with the Wild West and the end of the West as well. So I came to love it, and what I resisted 31 years ago turned out to be a 30-year love affair and getting involved in every way I could.
That's classic Northfield irony for you. Yeah. So it is very interesting because I think a lot of people look at the bank raid, even people who have been here for so long and know the story, and they look at it as maybe just having an impact on Northfield, but no, it had a real kind of ripple effect across the West and everything like that. But we'll get to kind of the aftermath of that after we look at the actual bank raid. So in my intro, I kind of provided a very bird's eye view of the situation and what happened on September 7th of 1876. But let's first talk a bit about the James Younger Gang, their status and their public image leading up to this day, and how kind of infamous they are at this point.
Well, the James and Younger Gang, some people call it the James Younger Gang. I tend to refer to it as the James and Younger Gang because it was a
controversial
member name.
Yeah.
What's that?
Controversial. Wow.
It gets worse. But there's a member of the gang named James Younger, and people tend to confuse that with it was his gang. But they got a start in 1866 robbing their first bank in Liberty, Missouri, called the Clay County Savings and Loan. And they it was very successful. They took around $60,000 as well.
Wow.
And it was the first daylight peacetime robbery in history. And that got them their start a year after the Civil War. But if you go back even before that, they grew up in a very tough area of the United States at the time, the Kansas-Missouri border.
Right.
And it was one of the most violent areas before and during the Civil War. And so I like to tell my guests and my tour guides that they came by some of this honestly. They saw a lot of atrocities from the North, and yet they did choose the life of crime. They could have gotten out of it, but they chose not to. So the truth is always there's a gray area in almost everything we talk about, and that includes here. But they were robbing banks for 10 years before they came here to Northfield. And they didn't come here to rob the Northfield bank. They came to Minnesota to rob a bank, and then decided on Northfield once they got here.
Pinpointed that fateful First National Bank, right? So how long was it until the Youngers were recruited? Because obviously Jesse James and Frank James, probably some of the most notorious names in the West, even though I guess they were technically from the South area. But when did the Youngers join forces with them?
Well, the first meetup happened to be between Frank James and Cole Younger when they rode with Quantrell's Raiders. Quantrell was a guerrilla fighter, and they joined him. Quantrell, he wasn't the only one. There were different bands of guerrillas where they tried to take the Civil War, into their own hands without leaving home, and they would ride over the border in Kansas, ransack a town, burn it down, perhaps kill some people, and run back. They were called border ruffians from Missouri. Kansas did the same thing. They were called the Jayhawkers. They would ride into Missouri. So there was this tit for tat action going on during the war and before the war. And under Quantrell, Quantrell was a leader, by the way, and one thing I always found interesting, before he formed this guerrilla group, it generally surprises people, not teachers, but surprises people that his job before that was a teacher. So you can only drive us so far before we absolutely go bonkers. And
Sure.
That's a joke I used to tell the students that I taught, that teaching led to this guerrilla warfare.
We didn't have a metal detector when you came through this morning.
No, you
so,
didn't.
Yeah.
No, I evaded that. So anyway, Quantrell, Frank and Cole met under Quantrell, and then they became best friends for life. And they became the leaders of the gang. And many people that come in here believe that Jesse James was the leader of the gang. He was a key member. He was good at what he did. He was daring. He was good with the gun, but he wasn't the leader.
Really?
Cole Younger and Frank James were the leaders. Cole didn't even particularly like Jesse James, mainly because Jesse brought too much notoriety to there. He was too public with what he did, and Cole would rather, probably sensibly, have a more low-key approach.
That makes sense when you're committing crimes. Yeah.
Yes. And so Frank, he tolerated Jesse because it was Frank's brother, and he was the best friend. And then later, Cole brought in Jim Younger. He had a brother named John he brought into the life of crime. John would get killed shortly after their exploits in bank robbing. And much later than that, he would bring in his brother Bob, who when he came to Northfield was around 22 years old.
Very young.
And the youngest in the gang. That's how
the youngest of the Youngers, yeah. So why do you think that, this is a question I've always wondered, is why was Jesse James so legendary, even though, like you mentioned, he wasn't the leader, but he was still a key role in that, but why was he really the one who got all the popularity? I imagine it's not just because his name is alliterative.
No, it's the same reason people often become popular today. He had a press agent, though we didn't call it a press agent back then. He had a supporter named Jonathan Newman Edwards, a newspaper editor, who embraced Jesse's cause. They were friends. In fact, Jesse would name his son after him. Excuse me. And he's the one Jesse would write to and make an alibi or plead his case or professed that he would gladly turn himself in if only he could get a fair trial. And many of these letters that appeared in Kansas City and in Missouri, many of these were concocted by Jonathan Newman Edwards. So people read about his daring exploits. And when I say people, I mean a lot of times children and teens and even adults. It was, think of it like a comic book. Or a graphic novel where people would read and get immersed in the story.
Yeah.
Well, that was Jesse truly was a legend in his own time, and Jesse loved it. He loved the popularity. He loved being a notable public figure. Again, the rest of the gang not so much, but that's how he became known as Jesse James.
Wow.
The hero, the Robin Hood, and all the other mythologies around it.
We've kind of talked a little bit about the different gang members and how they interacted and everything. By the time that they come to Northfield, it's 8 total gang members, correct? And yeah, so tell us a little bit about kind of the personality type of how they interacted, I guess.
Sure. It's interesting you said 8 people came here. There is some speculation, including George Huntington, the first one to write the detailed history of the story from Carleton College, a professor. He wrote the book Robber and Hero. He did research with people that were living at the time of the raid, and some people claim there were 9 here, and that's very interesting. We won't have time to get in the weeds with that. There could have been 9 here.
Really?
I don't believe, and I've looked into this a great deal. I believe there could be 9 here, but there weren't 9 on the street.
Okay.
I believe one could have been waiting for them in the big woods, but that's another story. But regarding personalities, I would characterize it like this. Let's start with the leaders. Frank James was cold and calculated, didn't have a great sense of humor, but he was a studious individual. It is said that he carried books with him wherever he went. He had a trunk with books and quoted Shakespeare.
I was just gonna say, I thought I remember that he quoted Shakespeare a lot too.
Right.
Yeah, kind of snooty. It sounds like.
Right. He was kind of a self-made scholar, and I question how learned he could have been, but the story came down that he was very, very educated. His brother Jesse, on the other hand, was the opposite. Jesse was very outgoing, very much the extrovert. Jesse was, today you would call Jesse an adrenaline junkie.
Okay.
He just had to keep pushing the envelope. Of all the gang members, it was Jesse who just couldn't get enough of this. He's the one who went on after the rest of them had quit. And he also was a rather paranoid individual. He loved practical jokes. He took after his mom, Zerelda, in many ways of his personality. He was a hot and cold type of individual. It is often said, and I think accurately, that if Frank wanted to kill you, you would never get him to talk you out of it. You'd never talk him out of that.
Really?
But Jesse, on the other hand, might be persuaded. So that encapsulates those two.
Sure.
Cole Younger is, by any account that I have read, he's a likable individual. He is a storyteller. He was gregarious. He loved being around people. I like to think that, and I'm not putting a sugar coat on his personality, because he was a killer, but he also followed, I think, a code that he didn't kill unnecessarily. Well, I shouldn't say unnecessarily. He didn't kill unless someone got in his way, which isn't true necessarily of the rest. Jim Younger was a rather quiet, I would often say a depressed individual.
Oh, okay.
He seemed to be the most reluctant to be an outlaw. He went into it headlong for the cause of the Civil War, but when it came to bank robbing, he always seemed to be a little more hesitant than the rest, and he took after Northfield probably the shortest end of the stick. Bob Younger idolized Jesse James. Bob Younger was one of those individuals, like I said, who would read about him by the campfire or the fireplace, and he so much wanted to be a part of the gang because he wanted to be near Jesse, because he fell for the publicity as well.
Right.
And that leaves us with Charlie, Bill Chadwell, and Clem Miller. three add-ons for the
Right,
Northfield.
the
We
extras,
don't know
yeah.
so much about them.
Really?
I won't go
Okay.
into detail because
Sure.
their history is rather scattered.
Mm-hmm.
We know that all of them came from the Missouri area. Charlie was a friend of the Younger family, and the other two, Bill and Clell, were associated with Jesse James. But their history on them is more sparse.
Sure. Yeah, they didn't make it quite as much into the history books, or at least the kind of legends passed down, it sounds like. All three of them ended up meeting their fate either during or post Northfield, I guess. So at this time they're very well known, and what makes them want to come to Minnesota after Missouri, right? Because that's where they had been robbing banks primarily.
Right. There's controversy in almost every part of the story, and that's one too. There's various theories as to why.
Sure.
I don't think anyone questions the fact it was not the smartest move, because coming up here in the north, they don't know the area like they do in Missouri. They don't have people that would protect them or hide them out. It was untapped terrain. But it also was very risky. So why did they do it? Why did they take that chance? One theory is that they were becoming too recognized in the South, that they wanted to lay low for a while. And I find this theory rather dubious, because if you're trying to lay low, the last thing you would do is come up north and rob a bank.
Right.
So it doesn't seem to me
Exactly.
that they were laying too low. Another theory is that they just did a robbery at a place called Rocky Cut, and one of the individuals in that robbery, Hobbs Carey, he became a state's evidence. He became an informant to the government, and they were running away from that. But here's why I think. First of all, what was attractive about coming to the north? Banks were not robbed in the north, so it would be unexpected. They thought that the people up here were a bunch of dumb sodbusters and that they would not put up any resistance.
Oh, they thought wrong about that.
Right, and we'll talk about why
Right.
later. But and they figured that it would be money for the taking. It's never been done. They could go in and out. I believe it was actually Jesse who wanted to come up to the north to this untapped area, and it's quite the story. But the way he manipulated the gang to get them to come along, because Cole vehemently was against coming up here, but Bob, who idolized Jesse, he wanted to come, and Cole had to look out
Family
for his brother.
feud,
Right.
yeah.
So it was manipulated by Jesse, but I think they felt that there might be something to it. It wouldn't be expected. But they also didn't know where they were going or what they were going to do when they got here, but they would find out when they scoped the area, which they did about a month. They got to Minnesota about a month before the Northfield
Really?
robbery.
Wow.
Yep.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense, since I suppose if they were primarily robbing in Missouri, they knew a lot of the area, but up here, it's kind of no man's land for them. So they tell us a little bit about the route they took too. You mentioned they got here a month earlier. Did they just kind of mill around and check out the town? Did they check out different towns until they came to Northfield? What areas did they travel into?
Good question. Well, first, the question is always how they got here. There was a theory that they rode their horses up here. That's one theory, but that is discredited with the notion that it's a long haul to take horses from Missouri to Minnesota. It would be unnecessary. And the people who support that theory say, well, they have the finest thoroughbreds, and they wouldn't want to find new thoroughbreds and retrain them. But those who know horses say it would have been no big deal for people as experienced as these guys to train a thoroughbred to be a horse that wouldn't freak out when they hear gunshots. So I think we can discount that. The next theory was that they use what's called land grant trains, where people could put their horse on a train and ride the train with the horses and then get them off. But again, that doesn't seem plausible, because it seems, again, a lot of work unnecessarily, and slow them down for what they really need. So the most, I think, credible theory is that they rode their horses to Council Bluffs. They sold their horses there. Then they got on a train and came to Minnesota. We know they bought horses in Minnesota, which adds credence to this theory. Mm-hmm. We know they picked up horses in St. Peter. We know they went to Red Wing. We know they went to Cannon City. They, I don't know if I said St. Peter. They were well traveled in Minnesota, but ultimately they hung out in St. Paul. Now, St. Paul was a den of iniquity, if you will. It was favorable. St. Paul was favorable to outlaws as long as you didn't commit any crimes in St. Paul. It was somewhat of a deal with the devil.
Okay, there. Safe haven, sort of.
Pardon me?
A safe haven for criminals, sort of. Yeah.
As long as you didn't commit crimes there. So it was shrewd to protect the safety and security of people in St. Paul, but it also gave a like you said, a safe haven for them. Mm-hmm. So we believe that it was in St. Paul, and talking to other people, that they learned the lay of the land in Minnesota, and that's probably where they first got attracted to Mankato, the bank they originally were going to rob in Minnesota.
Mm-hmm. Wow. So lots of setup. You have a lot of information, and to say the least. So it's I think that you rattled off 5 books worth in 30 seconds. So thank you for prepping us for it. So now they're in Northfield. We're fast forwarding to September 7th, 1876. And first of all, they ride, let's see, Frank James, Bob Younger, and Charlie Pitts ride down to Bridge Square. They dismount and walk into the bank. And Clell Miller and
Cole Younger,
thank you, are kind of keeping watch near here. J.S. Allen at some point yell together, "Get your guns, boys, they're robbing the bank." What tipped him off, and what tipped some of the other townspeople off about this?
Well, they were in town a week prior to this. So they were seen before wearing their white linen dusters. They wore that to hide their weapons and ammunition, but they posed as cattle buyers. That also gave them a reason to ride saddle horses, because they were out on the pasture looking at cattle. Because riding horses in the saddle was rather unusual back then. Mostly it was wagon, horse and buggy, horse and wagon. So that gave them a cover. So they were in town that morning as well. And so nobody suspected that these people were up to no good. Mm-hmm. But what tipped them off, you asked, is really a mistake made by Clell Miller. Clell Miller, as you mentioned, was guarding the street with Cole Younger outside the bank, out near the door. And when Bob, Frank, and Charlie went into the bank, the door was open to get a breeze going through there. It was a warm day. And they left the door open so they wouldn't arouse suspicion.
Right.
Now, Henry Wheeler, the son of the drugstore owner across the street, he saw this. And J.S. Allen, who was talking to a friend after he exited the bank, he also saw this. It was, again, no big deal. But when Clell Miller gets off his horse, he thinks, gee, they left the door open. And he shuts the door, but he doesn't go inside. Now they think J.S. Allen and Henry, why would a guy wearing a linen duster go to a bank and shut it without going in himself?
Yeah.
And that, I don't know if they thought at that point, hey, the bank is being robbed, but they knew something unusual was going on.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, and so then J.S. Allen gets in a bit of a quarrel with Clell Miller, correct? And that's when he yells out. And what happens immediately after he yells that phrase? Do people like Henry Wheeler and A.R. Manning immediately start running for their guns and how do the outlaws react?
Well, Henry Wheeler also gave a warning.
Oh, really?
He yelled, we have two ideas. We don't know which for sure. Robbery, or he yelled, robbery at the bank.
Okay.
And then he ran to the Dampier House, which is across the street, or kitty corner, which is today the above the Rare Pear and some other businesses.
Oh, right.
It was a big hotel back then. He ran there because the owner, Charles Dampier, had a army rifle there, and he knew that he might be able to do some damage.
That sounds like a fun name to say, by the way, Charles Dampier.
Yeah, Dampier, very French.
Yeah, exactly.
And so he ran there but the biggest contributor was J.S. Allen, as you mentioned, in terms of letting the people know, because he ran to Manning Hardware and yelled to Manning that the bank was being robbed. Then J.S. Allen ran to his hardware store right next door,
Wow.
and they handed out weapons to anyone who came in. And J.A.R. Manning grabbed the largest weapon, an old Remington rolling block rifle that was the largest. It was a buffalo gun in a sense, and he went out there, and that's the, I shouldn't say the extent, but those two, Manning and Wheeler, were the two most instrumental people in doing damage.
Right.
Oddly enough, there had to be other weapons, but we don't know about them. Well, we know a guy named Elias Stacy came up and he had a rifle with birdshot, and he hit Club Miller in the face with it, but it didn't.
Ouch.
It didn't have any much of an effect.
Okay.
But that, other than that, and the story that people were throwing rocks at the gang, it was really Manning and Wheeler who were the men of the hour, so to speak.
Right, and they are the ones who take down two of the outlaws right then and there. So what led to the deaths of Clell Miller and Bill Chadwell?
Well, the first one to make a shot was Manning, and he shot Bob Younger's horse.
Okay.
He said he regretted that. When I give a tour, we always hear the when we tell that story.
Right.
And
The animal lovers. Yeah.
I tease them because soon we're going to mention, of course, in the tour, the death of Joseph Lee Haywood, and I make sure they. Oh, that one too, but
yeah.
But he shot the horse, and he regretted it. He said later he regretted it, but he figured that could probably do the equivalent damage of preventing them from getting out of town.
Exactly.
So Bob's horse dies, and then he reloads. Meanwhile, Henry Wheeler across the street, Clell now has gotten on his horse. He shoots Clell in the shoulder, hits what's called the subclavian artery, and Clell bleeds to death. And then Manning has now reloaded. He's looking. This is, if you're ever in town, I encourage you to go to the end of the stairwell where you'd walk up the stairs and look as far as a block away. That's how far Manning was from Bill Chadwell.
Oh,
I
wow.
want you also to appreciate the fact when you're riding a horse, you're bobbing up and down and you're weaving right to left. With a rifle he's probably never fired in his life, it was probably an item he sold in the hardware store, he manages to hit Bill Chadwell in the heart.
Wow.
Bill literally is dead before he hits the ground.
That's crazy. So did he have any previous gun experience?
Manning?
Yes.
I would imagine most everybody here in that day did some hunting. In fact, a lot of the men who weren't bringing their crops in were probably out hunting what they called prairie chickens back then. It was like a grouse, and it was hunting season, and a lot of men were out there. So other than hunting, also Civil War. A lot of these men had Civil War experience as well.
That makes sense, yeah.
And so I would imagine most were familiar with the gun. But if you ever come to the reenactment, there is one boom in the gunshots that you're going to hear louder than any other, and that is Manning's rifle. Like I said, this was for putting down buffalo, and it was an amazing shot that he made, but with a very powerful gun. And I want to mention too, that is another advantage Northfield had over the Outlaws. The Northfielders had rifles. The Outlaws had revolvers.
Sure.
And it was far mismatched, as well as the fact that all the bad guys were wearing white. So it was easy to target who to shoot.
Yeah, so obviously they did not expect that this was going to happen, the Outlaws. So
can I speak to that for a minute?
Yeah, sure.
It was probably understandable that they didn't expect this kind of resistance, but if they gave this a little more thought, they might have.
Yeah.
Because of the fact that in the South, see, if you know the Civil War history, the North controlled the South after the Civil War. And they didn't just control seats of government and so on. They controlled the money as well. And the banks in the South that they robbed were generally... The deposits in these banks were generally by big business interests, a lot of times from the North. So if you're in a Southern big city, and the bank got robbed, it probably wasn't your money.
Oh,
what
really?
they didn't
Okay.
factor in is up here, however, in this small town of Northfield of about 2,000, 2,500, that money belonged to the people on the street. So
Okay.
there was no insurance then. So if that money's gone, it's gone for good.
Wow.
And so where they didn't meet a lot of resistance from the public in the South, they didn't factor in that they're taking money out of the pockets of everybody on the street
Okay,
here.
sure, yeah. There's lots of factors included. So now let's shift to what happened right downstairs from where we are in the First National Bank with Joseph Lee Haywood, Alonzo Bunker, and Frank Wilcox facing off against the three desperados. So, first of all, how long was this entire incident total within the bank, and what's the basic gist of what occurred?
7 minutes.
Okay.
The whole raid, beginning to end, lasted 7 minutes. It takes us longer to tell it than
Yes.
for it to actually happen. And by the way, when the reenactors do the reenactment, they time it down to 7 minutes.
Wow.
I've watched it many times, mostly from inside the bank because I'm giving tours. But they time it, and it's done. It's considered one of the most, if not the most, historically accurate reenactments in the U.S.
Really?
It won that award repeatedly
Wow.
by Wild West magazine. It is done to the moment. If you know the story, you can pretty much see everything happen. Cole came up to that door shouting at the men to get out 3 times. That's what the reenactors do.
Wow.
Bob's the first to leave, and that's what the reenactors do. But the story behind the bank. Now, do you want me to go into detail about what happened in the bank, or what do you? Where should I go here? 'Cause I
Yeah,
could
sure.
take-
If you want to kind of
Encapsulate
particularly, yeah, sure.
Okay.
And detail what occurred leading up to Joseph Lee Haywood's
Okay,
demise.
the 3 men working in the bank were the teller, Alonzo Bunker, the bookkeeper, Frank Wilcox, and the hero, Joseph Lee Haywood, who was acting as cashier that day. Well, the gang, Bob, Charlie, and Frank, came in, and I'm going to cut to the chase here. They roughed the men around. Haywood repeatedly risks his life to try to thwart the outlaws. And he denies being the cashier, but he was the cashier. He said the safe had a time lock. It did, but it wasn't operating.
It was open the entire time, correct?
It was, yeah.
Yeah.
The safe wasn't open, it was unlocked.
Oh,
And That's
right,
a
yes.
difference.
Uh-huh.
Because Charlie tried to go into the vault to get the money himself, and Haywood tried to lock him in. Charlie escaped. And Haywood screams, "Murder, murder," at the top of his lungs to intimidate the gang. Now, remember, these people have been the most successful outlaws, robbing banks and trains for 10 years and never met resistance. So needless to say, it throws them off their game quite a
Right.
bit. Also, they were drinking. Bunker and Wilcox will later testify that the scent of alcohol was really strong on them.
Wow.
Again, it reflects how seriously they did not take this raid.
Yeah, exactly.
Because that would not be something they
No.
normally would do. So in the scuffle, Haywood gets hit over the head by Charlie and knocked unconscious. He falls to the floor. And they proceed to try to get money, but Cole is yelling at them to get out of the bank. Eventually, they have to leave. Bob Younger is carrying the bag with all the money they got that day, which was $26.70. There was $15,000 in that safe that
Wow.
you mentioned was unlocked.
Right.
That's worth about $250,000 today. It would have been a good haul.
Yeah.
But they never pull the door because they don't want to risk getting locked in as Haywood tried before.
Okay.
So they leave with this paltry amount of money. There was also $3,000 in the cashier's till outside the vault, but they never opened that drawer. They opened a lot of them, they being Frank and Bob, but they never opened that one. So the last outlaw to leave was Frank James. He pauses, and he sees Haywood, who was recently knocked unconscious, slowly coming to, leaning against the table, weaving back and forth. I doubt Haywood even knew what was going on.
Right.
He certainly was doing all he can just to get his bearings.
Very dazed, yeah.
Using the table to steady himself. And Frank looks at this unarmed man who's certainly no threat to anyone and needlessly puts the revolver next to his head and pulls the trigger and coldly walks out the door.
Yeah.
And that is the end of Joseph Lee Haywood, who dies at the foot of the vault that contained the money that he saved.
it's so interesting that like that really kind of encapsulates, it seems, Frank James. You mentioned earlier he wouldn't really hesitate to kill, and obviously when he murdered this cashier when he did not need to at all, literally no threat, as you said, that kind of just encapsulates him. And I know a decent amount, not nearly as much as you, on this because I read the book Shot All to Hell by Mark Lee Gardner. Have you read that one?
Yes, we actually use it as our textbook for the training to be tour guides.
Okay, yeah, a great book. I would highly recommend it. Do we sell that here? Okay, yeah, we sell it at the History Center. And the infuriating thing about that is that Frank never served any time in prison, correct?
Correct. The Minnesota tried to, especially Northfield, to extradite him from Missouri so he would stand trial, but the governor of Missouri and other authorities purposely kept some crimes open in order to justify not extraditing him.
Wow.
So he goes to trial 3 times in Missouri. The first 2 trials, he's found not guilty. The third trial, a witness dies, wink, wink, right before the trial, and he's found not guilty, or they they just drop the trial. So they never extradited him. Minnesota tried, Northfield tried vehemently to get him up here, but he never served a day in prison for it.
Wow, that's very unfortunate, but ultimately some of the others did. So they flee town, the 6 remaining outlaws. Tell us a little bit about what happened in Madelia, because the James brothers split from the Youngers and Charlie
the
Pitts.
James gang, the James brothers, Frank and Jesse, split on September 14th to try to divert the posse, which was 1,000 men, the largest in U.S. history, looking for these guys. They do this successfully, and they escape the state and go down to Tennessee for a while. Now, remaining is the Younger brothers and Charlie Pitts. And by this time, most of Minnesota believes the whole gang got out of the state, and the posse disbands. So for a week, from the 14th to the 21st, the Younger brothers and Charlie Pitts are making their way in a southwest direction. Now, why were they going in that direction? The most logical explanation is they were trying to get to a horse farm where they could get some good horses and ride back home. But they were miserable. I mean, it's raining literally every single day for 2 weeks, and it's raining hard. This is a miserable experience. It's good for them in that it covers their tracks, but you can imagine in September in Minnesota with rain, it's cold.
Even the weather is working against them at this point.
Yeah, exactly. So in September 21st, they're spotted by a 17-year-old boy, a farm worker named Oscar Sorbel, and he notifies the sheriff of Madelia, Sheriff Glispin, who gets a posse, an impromptu posse together, and I should say ad hoc posse, and they corner them at a place near Madelia called Hanska Slough. And in there, the sheriff asks for volunteers. Only 6 volunteer with the sheriff, that makes 7, to go in and flush them out. And there's other posse members on the periphery trying to prevent any escape. So here the gang is hunkered down in this thicket, this wet thicket that they cannot be seen, so they have to be flushed out. So step by step, the posse goes in with their rifles, and Charlie wants to surrender because he knows they'll get captured, but Cole does not. Cole actually tells Charlie, I've been a wanted man for 10 years. This is the day Cole Younger dies.
Wow.
And Charlie says, well, Captain, because Cole was a captain in Quantrell's Raiders, so he's called Captain. Charlie says, well, Captain, I can die just as game as you can. Let's get it done.
Wow.
Charlie stands up, and that's when the bullets fly in Hanska Slough. The Cole Younger's hit 11 times. He lives.
And survives, yeah.
And survives.
Somehow.
Jim, he has one bullet lodge in his eye. If you look at the photo, you can see that.
We have some photos we'll take a look at here in a minute, yeah.
And Jim Younger gets hit 5 times. A bullet lodges in the base of his brain, busts his upper jaw. he lives.
Yeah.
And Charlie gets hit 5 times as well, but he dies. It pierces his heart. Bob Younger is surrendering with his hands in the air, and someone from the posse on the periphery, not one of the brave men who went in, wants to make a name for himself. So with Bob's hands in the air, he fires a shot, hits Bob in the lung, and Bob is aghast, saying, he shot me. I was surrendering and he shot me. And Sheriff Glispin yells, next one to fire a shot will be shot and killed by me. Cole Younger says afterward, that's when I knew we would get a fair trial. You see, Cole thought they were going to hang him right then and there, which they legally could have done. But he thought, God, this sheriff is willing to kill his own men to see that justice is done.
Sure.
Anyway, so the 3 men are treated for their wounds in Madelia and then head to Faribault to stand trial.
Wow, yeah, very intense, and that it's fascinating how much action can occur in only a few seconds, because I'm sure that didn't last very long, that gunfight. So now that back in Northfield, I want to talk a little bit because the History Center will be having a new exhibit on Haywood and his family. So now that Haywood has passed away and the town is mourning him, tell us a little bit about what you know about his family that he left behind.
Interestingly enough, before this raid occurred, when it was found out that Haywood would be acting cashier while the regular cashier is in Philadelphia, Haywood was asked, what would you do if someone tried to get the money? Would you fight him? And he says, of course, I guess I wouldn't let him have it. Little did he know, did anyone imagine that such a scenario would actually come to play. And so it shows his grit. But also after the story came out, shortly after the raid that Haywood died, his wife was informed of this, and her response was, I would have him do nothing less. So it really is a very the story of the bravery and the grit is exciting and everything, but these people, it seemed like it was it's like the seedbed of which these people's personalities sprouted, that this idea of, we do what is needed, not selfishly, but for the community.
Right. Exactly.
So he is the people contribute from all over the United States for a memorial fund for Haywood. He was the treasurer of Carrollton. He was the treasurer of the city. He had other jobs, and he was mourned greatly by the community. His wife, his daughter got an education through that memorial fund, and his wife eventually remarried, and she left Northfield. But Haywood is buried here in the Northfield Cemetery. At the time, it was the largest stone, maybe still is, at the time in it. And the defeat of Jesse James Days always begins with a memorial at that cemetery to make sure we don't lose sight of what is really important during this, quote, celebration.
Right, yeah. It's what makes it a celebration is Northfield's victory and the kind of the banding together of the town, I guess. So I should also mention that the reason that Haywood was acting cashier was because the bank managers were at Philadelphia's Centennial Exposition, I believe.
That's correct.
Yes.
And Northfield Flour won a gold award for being the best flour in the nation. Wow. Yep. And the GM Phillips and Nutting were there, and when they heard that the bank was robbed, they got a telegram. They immediately came up to figure out and help settle the bank, the robbery, the accounting, and all of that, and to of course mourn Haywood.
Right. So now we've covered a lot of ground here, but let's take a look at kind of the epilogue of the story, if you will, the aftermath of this, and how the biographies for the rest of the gang end now that the Youngers have been arrested and the James brothers have fled.
Okay, they go to Faribault to stand trial on 4 crimes: killing Haywood, of course, robbing the bank, of course, killing Nick Gustafson, a Swedish immigrant who died 4 days later after being shot on the street. He was from Millersburg. He was in town.
Oh, okay.
And then the other one was wounding with intent to kill Bunker. The teller, Alonzo Bunker, was shot at while trying to escape and did in fact escape. They plead guilty to avoid a hanging. Back then in Minnesota, if you plead not guilty and were found guilty, they had the option of hanging you, the death penalty. Mm-hmm. But if you pleaded guilty, that option was off the table. So they pleaded guilty and were sentenced to life in prison in Stillwater Territorial Prison, later Stillwater Prison. Bob Younger would die in 1889 due to complications of that bullet when he was surrendering. Mm-hmm. He died of what they called back then consumption, which was tuberculosis.
How old was he at this time?
Bob, 1889, so that would have been 13 years, 22, 30, about 35 years old.
There's some quick math for you, yeah.
Yes, it was. So he was about 35. Okay. And Cole and Jim were now left in the prison. They were model prisoners, and they were trusted, and they were, I think, trying to get out by good behavior from the day they went in. Mm-hmm. In 1901, they finally got a parole on two conditions. They couldn't enter into contracts, and they couldn't leave the state. After they get out, Cole has an easy time due to his gregarious nature, but Jim has a heck of a time. He can't find a job. Mm-hmm. He wants to get back to Missouri. He has a sweetheart named Alex Mueller, also called Alice Mueller. He met while in prison. She was a newspaper reporter for the St. Paul Pioneer Press, and she was freelance, and she did a story on socialism, which Jim was a socialist. Anyway, they fell in love. Long story short, they want to get married after he's on parole, but they can't because marriage is a contract. Mm-hmm. Alice leaves him, goes to Idaho. He can't follow because he can't leave the state. He hasn't eaten solid food in 25 years because that bullet near his jaw busted it up. He's got terrible migraines with that bullet near his brain. He can't find a job. His lady just left him. And in the Reardon Hotel in 1902 in St. Paul, he kills himself. Mm-hmm. Cole is given a pardon in 1903, and he is allowed to leave the state as long as he doesn't profit from his life of crime. And he starts a Wild West show with Frank for about a year. They don't like that life. It's oddly too decadent for them.
Really?
And it's corrupt, and everything that these guys made a living doing drew them away from the Wild West show. Uh-huh. Frank gives tours of his family farm. Near the end of his life, Cole goes on the lecture circuit, writes a book, mm-hmm. And his lecture is about what his life taught him, why crime doesn't pay. Mm-hmm. And I think he was sincere trying to tell the kids that looked up to him that it was miserable, his life, because mm-hmm. he lost two brothers, actually three, when Jim died, and he was on the run. He was incarcerated for 25 years. There was nothing glorious about mm-hmm. what he did.
Right. And then the legendary desperado Jesse James, he and Frank returned to Missouri, is that right?
They were in Tennessee for 3 years, laying low. They returned to Missouri. Never again would Frank ride as a bank robber or a train robber. Mm-hmm. But Jesse, like I said earlier in our conversation, he was an adrenaline junkie. He couldn't get enough. So he formed other gangs with different people that really weren't as trustworthy as the younger brothers.
AKA the Fords.
Yes, Bob and Charlie Ford among them. And eventually he would be assassinated by Bob Ford with Charlie in the room, too, mm-hmm. in his home in Missouri.
Right, yes. A very anticlimactic demise for such an outlaw, I would say. So that's the basic story of what happened in Northfield in 1876 and the aftermath. How impactful do you think this event was, not just for the James and Younger gang, but also for the Wild West as a whole?
Well, in one sense, we'll never fully know or appreciate how impactful, because after the Northfield raid, the gang will never ride again. So we will never know how many lives may have been saved and how many different futures were preserved because of the actions here in Northfield. So that's the big question mark that will never be answered. But In a sense, this is the end of the Wild West. I'm not saying that no bank was ever robbed again, but that mythology of the Wild West is coming to a close. We've had recently, at this time, Custer's Last Stand or the Battle of Little Bighorn. This whole motif of the Wild West and taming all of this, it's coming to an end. People are tired of that Civil War residue. The James Younger gang pretended, I'd say, that they were still fighting the cause of North and South. People wanted to move on. So I think the impact for Northfield certainly is that this was a town that was not then and even today. It's a town that's not going to let an outsider determine our future. Haywood established that then, and I think in many ways, even though we may disagree about the direction of Northfield, we all agreed that it will be decided by we, the residents, not some big interest outside.
Right.
And I think I could give example, or any listener could give example after example of how we come together to decide together what's going on. So I think he also taught us what a citizen who believes in his town can do. Nobody wanted Haywood to die. Haywood did not want to die. But the fact that he was willing to stand up for his community puts him at a level that few people can match. And I believe there's a Haywood in almost every town if you look deep enough. Haywood is ours. We celebrate it because what he did was very historically significant. But we all want to we strive to have the ownership in the community that he gave.
Absolutely. That's the principal takeaways, I would say, from the story as a whole. I want to briefly take a look because we have some items plucked from the Northfield History Center archives, including some pictures. I'll give you some if you want to go through them. And we can show the camera. These were postcards for a brief time, and they're pictures from, players in the Northfield raid and so forth. So one is of the famous photo of Joseph Lee Haywood. Is this the only photo that exists of him?
The only one I have ever seen.
Yeah.
Yes.
So, and I believe on the button for DJJD this year, it's colored too, so you get to see Haywood in color. And you can purchase these at the History Center.
And if you look at that picture of the bank, the inside of the bank, you will see that picture of Haywood you can see the corner of it in the top right. So shortly after the raid, they put his picture in the bank to honor him.
Wow, that's fascinating. I didn't know that. And then I said to Alexis Kraft, who brought these up for us, that I believe that these might be the only postcards ever with a dead body on them. So we have Clell Miller, post-mortem, I guess, after being shot in the shoulder. And then Bill Chadwell. This is labeled William Stiles, but there's some controversy about that, I believe, too.
Oh, yes. That would be too much to go into, but it's certainly Bill Chadwell. I'm going to get your listeners and viewers a real challenge. We think Stiles may have been the ninth man, but we absolutely know that is not Bill Stiles. That's Bill Chadwell.
Right.
And we have various presentations during Defeat Days at 50 North in town. And actually, if I could do a plug, we will be talking about the ninth man. There will be 3 seminars here on that day, and one we will talk about the ninth man. Right. I thought I'd give you this one, too. That's Charlie in post-mortem photo.
Right after the gunfight at Madelia.
And if you have Jim Younger in there?
Yes, I do.
We often, when on a tour, I'll ask people which ones in these photos are actually dead in the photo, and they almost always say Jim.
That's what I would say too, for sure. When I was reading that book, the Shot All to Hell, and they have pictures of this in here, and I was showing my mom, and she was like, "That guy's dead, isn't he?" But nope,
he's not
alive.
dead. In fact, I'll answer why did they take photos of dead people? 2 reasons. One, to show off. Look what we did. I mean, there's no question about that. But it had a practical purpose, too. Nobody knew who they were.
Yeah.
So it was the only way to identify them. To have their photo, you could eventually come to a conclusion as to who these people were.
Sure. And then here are quick pictures of the younger brothers. This is Cole after being shot. You can tell through the eye. Or was it through the back of the head? And then
No,
it came
in the
through
front.
Okay.
It just lodged in his eye. Didn't
Right.
cause any damage to the eye, oddly enough, but...
And then this is Bob Younger, who I understand after being arrested was the ladies tried to kind of I guess court him
Yes.
a bit, even though he was
In
an
the
outlaw.
Faribault jail, they would come to see Bob. He was quite attractive to the ladies, and they would give undergarments to him to try to solicit his favor. Not much Bob could do about it in jail, but he
Exactly.
he really didn't. He had a girlfriend back home in Missouri named Maggie.
Oh, okay.
And of course, he couldn't see her after this either. But when he died, he talked about his. One of his last words would tell Maggie, "I was thinking of her."
Oh, really?
As he died, yeah.
Okay. And what's fascinating is also when you look at these, I mean, Bob Younger, he's in his early 20s here. I think he said 22 when he came
Correct.
here. And they all look so much older. And, I mean, it's really interesting. They always looked a bit older back in the day. If you want to show your camera some of the photos you have there.
All right, we have Frank on the left and Jesse on the right. Interestingly enough, there were not a lot of photos out there of the gang members because they protected their identity quite fervently in the fact that they didn't want people to know how they looked. So Jesse James, this idea that you see all these wanted posters with Jesse James on them, those are usually fakes because
Really?
the photos of these men were owned and preserved by the family, and they didn't hand them out. This was not like a high school photo day where they handed their photos out. They
Sure.
kept them very close to themselves.
Okay, I see.
And we also have a photo of the Medelia Seven, the 7 men who went in. Sheriff Glispin, W.W. Murphy were some of the key men that went in after the gang. It's funny because they got into their Sunday go-to-meeting clothes, and a lot of them look like they don't really fit into them, but they were brave men. They risked their life.
Yeah,
in fact,
sure.
in this shootout, one man whose wrist was grazed, and the other got hit in the chest, but he had a briarwood pipe in his pocket,
Wow,
and it
no
hit the
kidding.
pipe, and the bullet ricocheted and lodged in his belt.
Have you ever heard the story about Theodore Roosevelt when somebody tried to shoot him and he had like a folded up speech in his breast pocket that saved his life? Pipe
think-
is more sturdy, but
I think of that every time. I hear this. I always think of Teddy, and he continued on with the speech. And then we have a photo of the bank at the time of the raid. We don't have a lot of photos of the building at that time. Remember, the town was only, 24 years old, I believe, at the time?
Yes.
55,
Or
60, 21 years.
21
years.
yep.
And so
Old
this
enough
is,
to drink alcohol.
this is how it looked and how pretty much it looks today.
Yeah. And Lee and Hitchcock, that's prominent. So was that a business in the Scriver building at the time?
Right. The Scriver building was the Mall of America of 1876. They had the Lee and Hitchcock dry goods. They had above that, they had the Whiting Dentist. They had the bank. They had the Whipple Law Office. And then they had the Scriver Dry Goods as well, or
Okay.
Scriver General Store. So 5 businesses in one building. And it was unusual to have a limestone building. Most buildings back then were made of wood, and that's why as many towns burned down after they caught fire. But this limestone building was actually made by the first mayor of Northfield, Hiram Scriver.
Right, yes. A great name, by the way, Hiram Scriver. And I'm just going to show the camera this real quick, and I'll zoom in on it in post-production. This is the history of the DJJD buttons across all the years since its origination in 1948. This goes up to 2011. Kind of a lot of different themes. I would say a lot of them do have the picture of Haywood, but then there's there's different styles, so it's interesting. Last thing before I let you go here, I really mined you for a lot of information, but I want to do a quick lightning speed round,
Okay.
in which I'll just ask you some quick questions, and I think they'll speak volumes about you as a person. So, what's the best movie about Jesse James?
The best movie about Jesse James is The Assassination of Jesse James with Brad Pitt. It's the only one that absolutely nails how Jesse James was, paranoid and practical joker. It doesn't have much to do with Northfield, but it's a dead-on, I think, accurate factually. Relating to Northfield, probably The Long Riders, which is about 50% accurate.
Okay, much less accurate than the first one, it sounds like. I recently watched The Assassination of Jesse James by the coward Robert Ford, and I enjoyed it. It's kind of a slow burn, but I love the cinematography, and I didn't know as much about that era of his life, so it was interesting. Best book about Jesse James or the Northfield Raid?
I would, again, I have to do a tie for two. One you already mentioned, Shot All to Hell, and the other would be The Last Hurrah of the James Younger Gang by Robert Bauer Smith. Those two I use them interchangeably every other year in my class.
Okay. Most interesting fact about any of the James Younger Gang?
Most interesting fact. I would say it was interesting then is that Jesse was identified by a missing digit. His first digit of his middle finger his index finger was shot off. That was the telltale mark. Nobody really knew how Jesse looked. So you will never see a photo of that finger, that hand with the missing finger, because any photo he always hid that, either with another hand, with the glove, or so that's an interesting fact.
And how old was he when he had that shot off?
He did it when he was riding with Bloody Bill Anderson, another gorilla outfit. Yeah. So he would have been about 20, I would say not even that, about 16, 17 years old.
Okay, yeah, and I'm just about that age. I'm 17, and I wouldn't want part of my finger shot off, so that would not be fun. Favorite DJJD activity?
For me personally?
Yeah.
Well, oddly enough, I've hardly ever seen the reenactment because I've always been inside.
Sure.
I've seen just parts of it here and there. Obviously, that would be, if I ever saw the thing, it would definitely be that. But I know the story. I don't need to. But for me, I think for me personally, I don't do the fair. I don't do that sort of thing. I think just the way, I'm going to be kind of a cop-out, just the way the town comes together. I like Townie Night. Yeah. I like the way we as a community come together, just like we did way back then. But I have to say, I absolutely love the fact that they have a memorial to Haywood to kick it off. Yeah. Because I never want to lose sight. Hope we never lose sight of why we're celebrating it all.
Right. Absolutely. And then final lightning question. What's the best question you've ever been asked about the James Younger Gang? I'm making you think quick here, aren't I?
Yes, no, but I'm a teacher. We are used to thinking on our feet. The best question I ever got, I think it would have been, and it's one that I have a hard time to answer, is when they were in Northfield, could Cole have killed? We don't know if Cole killed anybody. He was leading out there. He was shooting at a lot of people, but was he deliberately not trying to kill people? That is a question I've always pondered. Did Cole preserve? Did he live by that code? Yeah. That people say. And another question. I'm gonna change it. Okay. The coolest question I ever got was, if you could go back in time, where would you put yourself? Oh, wow. Where would you put yourself to see that happen? And I change places all the time. I'd probably put myself next to Wheeler across the street. Okay. But I would love to know if there were 9 men or 8 men here. Right. I would be counting. I would love to have been here. I know we're about done. Yeah. Can I talk a minute about the posse, the training thing?
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Okay. Yeah. Because this is a great venue for me to talk about it. We have students who are either 9th or 8th grade, 8th, 9th, or even beyond in high school, that we train to be tour guides during the summertime. They give weekday tours, 10 10, and I recruit them through their classes at Northfield Middle School and High School. But what I really want to emphasize is we're always looking for adult tour guides who give tours on weekends in the summer. I have a hard time getting the message out because I don't know how to get the message out, but we want tour guides where you will be trained, you will attend a series of classes with the kids, and it's a lot of fun being with the students. And you will be given a script. You'll be given everything you need to know to give a tour. And you'll meet people from all over the United States, if not the world, on weekends during the summer. So if you're interested in this, call the Historical Society, and they'll get you in touch with me, or I'll get in touch with you, and we can build up that body of tour guides that we always need.
Awesome. Would you ever make an exception for somebody going into a junior year?
Oh yeah, we've had seniors and
Okay.
juniors. We generally fill it out, but we try not to turn too many people down. Like this year,
Right.
we were going to bring in 18. We had to bring in 19.
Wow, nice.
Because and it turned out to work out because one person ended up not being able to give the tours, so we had someone to fill. So
Right,
yes,
great.
we've had high schoolers. We have students who've given them from 7th grade to their senior year.
Well, I might be in touch with you
Well,
about
I
that.
hope so. I've
right.
enjoyed this a lot.
Yeah, thank you
Kosmo.
so much for all the information you provided. I've learned a lot, and I'm just waiting for you to write a book about it. So.
I had led the
Really?
students into writing 3 books.
Wow.
One is called Caught in the Storm, about the escape of the James Younger gang. It's a field guide that you can travel and see the sites.
Awesome.
Our 8th grade students wrote that. We wrote a history of Northfield for the elementary students, and we wrote the first and only history of Northfield, book on the history of Northfield.
Really?
Isn't it surprising to know that no one's ever written about
Yeah.
the history of Northfield?
I'm shocked
They've
about
done it
that.
in brochures.
Sure.
They've done history of Carleton, history of, but
Right.
not a general history.
Wow.
And our 8th grade students had done that as well. That's called Eden on the Cannon, and we sell all of these books at your museum bookstore. And the profits are used to help out with the museum youth education programs. So we'd love to have you on board, and
Great.
I guarantee you we'll have a place for you. And
Thank
I will
you.
say, this thing that you're doing, I never met you. I don't know what this was going to be about, but I got to give kudos to you. This was
Thank you.
enjoyable. I'm amazed
you.
at how on the ball you are with all this information, and the questions were very piercing and very appropriate to this story. And there's a lady behind the camera you don't meet named Bryn Artley,
Yeah, that's
who's
right.
also I'm a big fan of hers too. She's our
Yes.
media director, and she's
sure.
the one who makes us look good. Me, of course, more than you, but she makes it look good.
well, cinematography can do a lot, especially when I'm wearing a cowboy hat with glasses, so it doesn't really match. But, well, thank you very much for the kind remarks, Earl. I appreciate it, and I'm glad that I asked piercing questions. That's it's good to know that I get to the heart of the matter. So thank you for coming
You bet.
in.
Thank you.
Really appreciate it. Great to meet you, and thanks for trekking through time.
I enjoyed it.
Wow, we covered a lot of bases. Almost as many as Mickey Mantle. That's my weak attempt at a sports joke. I'll get there someday. In fact, it'll be a home run. Still not there. Thank you very much to my memoir maestro this month, Earl Weinmann, for teaching me and the listening audience about an important event to remember from Northfield's past beyond just one weekend every year. My appreciation extends to Northfield History Center cool cats Sean Allen, Mark Thornton, and Bryn Artley, as well as Rich Larson and Jeff Johnson at KYMN Radio. And congrats to Jeff on a well-deserved retirement after 37 years at the station. Join me in wishing him good luck as he embarks on a new journey. Of course, I won't leave out my parents in the gratitude also. My PSA wraps up with a note that Triple T will now start airing a week earlier on the first Thursday of every month on KYMN at 9 o'clock a.m. Hope to see, or I guess hear you then, starting on October 3rd. At this point in closing the show, I normally highlight what I dub an archival anniversary, a national historical event passing a new birthday. However, I think it's fair to instead keep the limelight shining on the remembrance of the Northfield bank raid 148 years ago that would affect the history of Western and Southern crime forever, and the remarkably significant role that Joseph Lee Haywood played in that circumstance. This has been Voyage 4 of Trek Through Time. I'm your host, Kosmo Esplan, reminding you to make history happen.